By the end of the 17th century, Europe has developed durable internal hierarchies. Western and Central powers often see themselves as more orderly, more advanced, more legitimate. Eastern and frontier populations are increasingly framed as volatile, backward, or in need of supervision. These administrative habits will matter deeply in the centuries to come. Because once identity is bureaucratized, it becomes easier to racialize it. The 19th century is a turning point. Up until now, hierarchy has largely been administrative, religious, or class-based. In the 1800s, it becomes ideological, and increasingly biological. A. Nation-states demand uniformity. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars reshape Europe. The idea of the nation spreads rapidly. Not empire, not dynasty, but nation. One people, one language, one shared history. This idea, known as Romantic nationalism, becomes politically explosive. Here is the causal shift. Romantic nationalism leads to the belief that political legitimacy comes from cultural unity. Cultural unity requires linguistic and historical standardization. Standardization turns minorities into problems. In multi-ethnic regions, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, this becomes destabilizing. Because these territories are not linguistically uniform, they are layered. After the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, Hungary gains internal autonomy within the Habsburg Empire. Hungarian elites now face a demographic reality. Magyars are not the majority in many regions of the kingdom. Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Ruthenians, large Slavic and non-Hungarian populations live within Hungarian borders. This creates political anxiety. The response is Magyarization. In the late 19th century, Hungarian authorities systematically promote the Hungarian language in schools, administration, and public life. Non-Hungarian language education is restricted. Civil service positions increasingly require Hungarian fluency. Place names are changed. Family names are often Magyarized. Access to upward mobility becomes tied to linguistic assimilation. This is not random prejudice. It is structural. Nation-building logic requires unity. Unity requires assimilation. Assimilation pressure targets minorities. And once minorities are framed as obstacles to national coherence, they are no longer just different. They are politically inconvenient, even dangerous. Race science enters the conversation. At the same time, something else is happening across Europe. New theories of race emerge. Writers like Arthur de Gobineau argue that humanity can be divided into ranked racial categories. These ideas mix nationalism, pseudoscience, and social Darwinism. And crucially, they begin ranking Europeans internally. In some racial hierarchies of the late 19th century, Nordic or Germanic peoples are placed at the top. Slavs are often placed lower in the ranking. Not outside Europe, but below its supposed civilizational core. This is new. Earlier hierarchy was about religion or class. Now it is framed as inherent, as natural, as biological. Nationalism creates pressure for uniformity. Uniformity produces assimilation policies. Race theory naturalizes hierarchy. Naturalized hierarchy makes inequality seem inevitable. By the mid-19th century, Europe was undergoing rapid transformation. Industrialization was reshaping cities. Mass literacy was spreading. Democratic movements were emerging, and elites were nervous. Universal male suffrage began expanding in parts of Europe. Working-class movements were organizing. Nationalist uprisings were destabilizing empires. Old aristocratic orders feared losing control. And in times of social anxiety, hierarchy often seeks new justification. The rise of social Darwinism. After Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, evolutionary theory began to influence political thought. Some thinkers, often inaccurately, applied evolutionary ideas to human societies. This became known as social Darwinism. The argument was simple. If species compete in nature, then human groups must compete too. And if some groups dominate others, that must reflect biological superiority. This logic allowed inequality to appear scientific, not political, not historical, natural. Gobineau and Ranked Europe. One of the most influential early racial theorists was Arthur de Gobineau. In his multi-volume Essay on the Inequality of the Human Races, published in the 1850s, he argued that civilizations rise and fall based on racial composition. He ranked human groups hierarchically, and crucially, he ranked Europeans internally. Nordic, or Germanic, peoples were elevated as civilizational drivers. Slavs were often described as less dynamic, less creative, more passive. Still European, still white, but inferior. This is a critical shift. The hierarchy is no longer about law, class, or religion. It is about blood, about ancestry, about permanent traits. Social Darwinism plus elite fear of political upheaval creates demand for stable hierarchy. Racial theory supplies it, and once hierarchy is framed as biological, it becomes difficult to challenge. By the late 19th century, the newly unified German Empire faced a structural anxiety. Its eastern provinces, especially Poznania and parts of West Prussia, contain large Polish-speaking populations. These were not distant colonies. They were inside the empire. German unification in 1871 had strengthened the state, but it had also sharpened borders. And with borders came a new fear. What if we lose the East? The concern was not immediate rebellion. It was demographic. In eastern provinces, Polish populations were growing. German elites began to speak in terms of numbers, birth rates, settlement patterns, land ownership. A new logic took hold. Population is territory. Whoever settles the land owns the future. State building plus border insecurity produces demographic anxiety. Demographic anxiety produces competition ideology. And competition ideology turns neighbors into rivals. In 1886, the Prussian government created the Royal Prussian Settlement Commission. Its mission was clear: purchase land from Polish landowners, resettle it with ethnic German colonists. This was not informal discrimination. It was state-funded demographic engineering. Over the following decades, thousands of estates were bought and redistributed to German settlers. The goal was numerical balance: shift the population, secure the border. Language policy tightened. Polish language schooling was restricted. Children in some regions were punished for resisting German language religious instruction. Civil service careers required German fluency. Place names were Germanized. Cultural autonomy was treated as political risk. This was not yet biological extermination, but it was institutional pressure. Assimilate or lose opportunity, or lose land. In 1918, the First World War ends, and with it, the old empires collapse. The German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. In their place, new nation-states emerge across Central and Eastern Europe. Poland is reborn. Czechoslovakia is created. Yugoslavia forms. Borders shift dramatically. But these new borders do not separate peoples cleanly. They cut through mixed regions, villages, cities. Entire provinces contain large ethnic minorities, and that creates a new structural problem. Empires tolerated diversity because legitimacy came from dynasty. Nation-states demand homogeneity because legitimacy now comes from the people. But what happens when the people are divided? Empire collapse produces new borders. New borders produce minorities. Minorities produce loyalty anxiety. And loyalty anxiety produces paranoia. In the newly reconstituted Poland, millions of Ukrainians, Belarusians, Germans, and Jews lived within its borders. In Czechoslovakia, millions of ethnic Germans suddenly found themselves minorities. In Yugoslavia, Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes were joined into a single state, but with deep internal divisions. Across the region, governments faced the same question: who truly belongs, and who might undermine us from within? Nationalist propaganda began mapping ethnicity onto security. If a minority group had cultural or linguistic ties to a neighboring state, that link could be framed as potential disloyalty. Their presence became evidence of vulnerability, not necessarily because of action, but because of identity. Older frames were readily available. Eastern peoples had already been described as backward, as unstable, as politically immature. Now those narratives could be reactivated. In interwar Germany, resentment over lost Eastern territories fueled revisionist rhetoric. Polish control over former German lands was portrayed as illegitimate. Poles were described in nationalist propaganda as incapable of governing properly. In parts of Eastern Europe, minorities were accused of harboring irredentist ambitions. The language shifted from cultural difference to internal threat. Ethnicity became securitized. To be linguistically or culturally different was no longer just to be different, it was to be suspect. Security logic does something powerful. It lowers the threshold for discrimination. Because once a group is framed as a potential threat, preventive measures feel justified. Restrictions on minority language use, limits on political representation, policing of cultural organizations, surveillance of border populations. These policies were often framed not as prejudice, but as national defense. The enemy within story becomes durable during this period, and once a population is mentally coded as an internal danger, it becomes easier to escalate treatment in times of crisis. By the late 1930s, Europe is again unstable. Economic depression has radicalized politics. Extremist movements promise restoration and security, and they inherit a landscape already shaped by demographic fear and ethnic suspicion. The stage is set. In 1939, Germany invades Poland. The Second World War begins. But for Nazi leadership, this is not just a military conflict. It is a racial project. The Nazi worldview combines three powerful ideas: Lebensraum, living space, racial hierarchy, and settler colonial expansion. Eastern Europe is imagined not as equal territory, but as space. Space to be reorganized, cleared, exploited, repopulated. Racial ideology defines hierarchy. Lebensraum defines geography as destiny. War provides opportunity. And together, they translate prejudice into program. In Nazi racial thinking, Jews were targeted for total annihilation. But Slavic populations were also placed low in the hierarchy. They were categorized broadly as Untermenschen, subhumans, not always marked for immediate extermination, but marked as inferior, as labor, as expendable. This ideology was not abstract. It became policy. One of the clearest examples is General Plan Ost. This was a long-term planning framework developed by Nazi officials for the future of Eastern Europe. It envisioned the removal, through killing, expulsion, or starvation, of tens of millions of people: Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Russians, and others. Large portions of the surviving population would be reduced to forced labor. A small percentage of children deemed racially valuable might be forcibly Germanized. The rest would make room for German settlers. This was demographic engineering on an unprecedented scale. Not spontaneous brutality, but organized vision. Maps were drawn, population calculations were made, timelines were discussed. Alongside this, the hunger plan was implemented. The idea was brutally simple. Food from occupied Soviet territories would be redirected to Germany. Urban populations in the East would be allowed, even expected, to starve.